for an old man, he moved pretty fast that day. And it's the only cross words he ever told me. We grabbed hold of that thing, we got it off the track probably with half a mile to go or a quarter mile. But he told me, don't ever try to do a man's work if you're only a boy. But he was just wonderful to work for. He insisted that he be called Steve, not Mr. Stevens. And he taught me what the telegraph code for Crete sounded like. And I've never forgotten it. I never did learn the Morse code, but if I were to hear, I'd go get him. And that was Crete, and he was being called on the key. And he'd let me practice on the key, because they had a little sounder right in there in the windows. And there were copper bus bars, a few of them that were running there. And he told me, never touch them. You're a bad shot. And this, maybe a month later or whatever, I was horsing around, sitting in there, and there was something going down the tracks, and I wasn't big enough to really lean forward and see down the outside the full windows, so I kind of put one hand up there to help myself. The next thing I knew, I put the other hand up there to see what was going on down that track. And he had an old office-type chair, the type that would spring way back. Well, the next thing I knew, I was flying out off the back of the chair on the floor, just missed the potbelly stove. And I turned around, mattered in a wet hand to see who had flipped my chair over, and there wasn't anybody there. And I think he came in about 5 minutes later, and I guess I was still white as his sheet. And he asked what happened, because I didn't have to tell him anything was wrong. He knew something was wrong when he saw me. He would get telegrams, and normally he would just make a phone call. But my pay was $0.10 a telegram to deliver it if they came in. And I was just old enough to use my sister's bicycle. So I would guess that through that summer, I probably had all of 10 or 12 telegrams to deliver in the village of Crete. Normally, he would just call somebody on the phone, tell them what the message was, and throw it in the mail to back it up. But if people didn't have a phone, then we had to get that telegram. I think the furthest I traveled was out to Exo's house on the Milwaukee Railroad out there. And this, when this was going on, would have been in the 40s, probably around 1944 or something like that. And I think World War II was maybe still going on then. I'm not a real big history buff. When did the war get over? 45. 45, okay. So it wasn't unusual to get duffel bags sent home. Soldiers and airmen and sailors would be sending home sometimes 2 or 3 duffel bags, and we knew they were on the way coming home then. One kind of thing that people used to joke about a lot, and I don't remember the names, but it was a railroad family, which we had a lot of railroad families working in Crete, lived down on Wood Street. And their son, I believe it was, but anyhow, someone in the family sent home this huge trophy fish packed in dry ice. And Steve called them immediately, let them know this beautiful fish was there. They came, picked it up, invited the whole neighborhood for a fish fry. The next day, the letter came asking that the fish be taken to a taxidermy. So the Railway Express beat the first class mail from northern Minnesota or something. One other thing that sticks with me from when I was working there at the depot, I take a break and go get an ice cold drink of water. We used to have the fountain running in the park. And I'm in there having this drink of water, and all of a sudden some newspapers started rustling, and I see there was a bum covered, and that was not unusual. They rode the rails, covered the newspapers to keep the chill off. And he startled me, and he looked at me and he said, "Son, is that poison ivy on your arm?" I had an arm that was about the size of a football. And he said, "Yeah." He said, "Does your dad have a garden?" I said, "Yeah." He said, "You go home and you take the tomato leaves and rub the residue from the tomato leaves on that poison ivy, and it is going to be gone in a couple of days." And I've been fighting poison ivy for a month in that arm, and he was ready. It got rid of that poison ivy for me. The express stuff that came through was always nice, and then in the springtime we get a lot of baby chickens. We'd be in the little cartons,
100 to a carton.
whatever. Yeah, they're being shipped. Yeah,
I like that.
yeah, and it seems even that we had bees that were shipped in like a screen basket or something. The thing that kind of stuck with me most was the duffel bags. And we could see where they were shipped from. A few of them were coming in from Honolulu. I remember that name. Then one day, we came to work, and there was a hole through the side of that bay window that stuck out there, but through the floor, down about a foot off the sidewalk. And I thought someone had just hit it with a hammer, done some vandal out there. We found a piece of steel laying right where your legs normally were sitting if you're at the telegraph table. And I think Eck Carnes was in there. Eck worked for track maintenance. And he looked at it and he said, "Well, that's a piece of track." So we started walking, and just about at the grade crossing right there by the lumber yard, I don't know if that was 60, 70 yards away or so, there's this chunk of rail that just split out from the end of a rail. Well, now we've got continuous welded rail. At that time, you had them bolted together every so many feet. And I'm sure it would have broke your leg if it would have hit you, because it just shot through there like a big piece of shrapnel.
Did you have to notify someone on the railroad that the rail was broken?
I'm sure that, Eck Carnes was maintenance.
Oh, so that was his job.
Yeah, I don't know what he did, but.
Couldn't it have caused a derailment?
Oh, yeah, I think it could have. They used to have railroad telephones, which they had a box outside the depot, and we also had the phone inside. And they were like a party line, and I don't know how far they went. If it went down to C&EI or wherever the C&EI was running, and into Chicago, or maybe not the Chicago office. But it was fun just to pick up the line and listen to the different conversations going on up and down the line. Then we had, I think that year we had a bad accident. A gentleman was killed. And from what the engineer said, he never moved. He just sat on the rail. The guy pulled the whistle. It must have been out about in line with Zion Church on the south end of town. And we heard, it was late in the afternoon, maybe early evening, I think it was after the dinner hour, and we heard the brakes lock up on this. The horns just kept blowing, and we could hear this shrill of the brakes locked up as they just skidded down the track. And we instinctively, all the kids that happened to be out around near my house, realized something was wrong, and we shot for the railroad tracks. And if I want now, I see the image of this hole in the guy's head, and he was dead, lying there. and they were trying to get hold of a coroner. I guess they couldn't move the train till they had a release from the police or the coroner. So right away I popped, and he had to get hold of the station master in Crete. So I popped right up and said, I work for him. And so they cut the engine loose, and we rode on the cow catcher on the front of the engine down to the depot, and then I ran down to Steve's house and got him, and he came back and rode back to the scene of the wreck. It just, for a 9 or 10-year-old, it was quite an experience for me. It was just one of those memorable things. Another thing that I remember are the Blanton boys. We used to work for Ned in the coal yard. I don't know if you remember them working there. And Tom Blanton was my age. And we were either 9 or 10 at that time. And this boy at that age would load a dump truck full of coal with a scoop truck. It was just unbelievable. Today, you know, they just won't allow anything like that. And I think he probably got paid by the load, not by the hour or whatever. And Tom, he was a lot smaller than I was when I was in 4th grade. And it was just kind of unbelievable. And then that next year, I think Steve had to take a forced retirement. And rather than sit idle, he became the distributorship in Crete for the Star newspaper. And Tom and I helped him to deliver the Star. Do you know, did he have a Buick or what that old blue car was?
Got a Buick, yeah.
Running boards on it.
All we ever had.
All the newspapers you could get in the back of that. Tom on one running board and myself on the other. And we drove through all the town, all the streets in Crete, delivering these papers. And I don't know if he got ill or something, but just shortly after that, then they told him that it was too much, or he told them it was too much for him to handle. But Tom and I each ended up with a route in Crete, and they didn't want to let us have it at our age. I think they said they didn't take anybody under 12 years old usually. But Steve went to bat for us. And he said if there were problems collecting, because they were concerned with us handling the money, he said that he would help us with collections, which I think he did, maybe the first month. But one other thing with that old Buick, when you had parcel or Railway Express come in, Steve would put a card in the mail instead of delivering it. Maybe sometimes he would call, especially if it was perishable or something. But it all would accumulate till Friday afternoon. And Friday afternoon, Tom would usually come over to the depot, and 2 in the afternoon or something, we'd load all the express in that old Buick. There was no back window in it, so if we had long parcels, they stuck out of the back window. And we drive out to Lincolnshire, we deliver everything out there, and then if there are a few parcels in Crete, and then we'd end up at Cushman's. And he'd buy us ice cream cones. That's basically what I remember.
Tell quick how you treated his arthritis.
Oh, you know, another story I forgot. Two, I'm glad you said that. Carol, you probably know more than I do. The night that you talked with me on the phone, things just seemed to flow. Did you have notes? For his arthritis, he had legs, so help me, must have been about that big in diameter. It wasn't very big. He pulled that pants as high as he could get it and put a piece of black felt paper around it and sit out there in the sunlight waiting for the mail train to come in at 9:30 or 10 in the morning. Yeah, just to that paper would help get the heat around it, like his heat. And one thing that really stuck with me too that I forgot. We came in from delivering the Railway Express one day, and I had seen fellows come in as the trains would slow down before they stopped. they'd hop off and come walking up to the depot with a letter or something for them, or a note. So we came in to park at the depot, and I decided if other people could jump off of something moving, I could too. So I jumped off and I planted my feet. Well, your momentum just keeps you going. And those of you who remember the old park roads, it was black cinders. So I got up, and I got cinders and blood down both forearms and some on my forehead. And I'm walking up to the depot with Tom Blanton and Steve. And Steve turned around, what's that, man? I'm picking stuff. He said, what happened? You know, and I told him, I said, well, I jumped off. I said, I see him jump off. I see him jump off, they step off and would walk right with the train. He said, well, you gotta move when you do that. So here's this probably 70-some-year-old man driving in circles or in the parking lot there. So Tom Blanton and I could jump off of the boards to learn how to, and he started out at a crawl, and I think he got it up to 10 or 12 miles an hour. Everett, that's about all I remember. You have things to add there?
Oh, I don't even know how I got shanghaied into doing this.
I don't either.
I'll share some things with you.
You got Shanghai because I gave you a call.
Right. And somebody called me today, so you made the front page of the Crete Record. I said, whoa. Let me read something to you. A lot of you people knew my wife, Marge. Her dad was a railroad man for the C&EI. Marge worked quite a bit during her college years, come home vacation times, Christmas and other vacation periods. She would work up at the freight office in Chicago Heights on East End Avenue, just south of the EJ&E tracks. There was a big wooden freight office there. This is a picture of Marge's dad. This is Grandpa Olson, Wallace Olson. And Marge would take his job, and then he would do other clerks. He was a clerk, and he would do other people's jobs, do some work down at the yard on 26th Street. But this was in the office at the freight office there. And if you'd indulge with me, about 7 minutes maybe, I think Phyllis will enjoy this. This is Walt's account of his C&EI childhood by Walter Olson. Walt is Marge's cousin. He's retired United Church of Christ minister, lives up in the north suburbs of Milwaukee. He would love to have been here. They've got house guests this week. But Walt worked a lot on the C&EI, on the section gangs and anything else, all through high school. When they redid the new rails here in Crete and with all the ballast and everything, and reworked that. He and a bunch of other high school kids worked on it. And one of the things they were toughening up for football. So that was. Let me just share this with you. This is C&EI Childhood by Walter Olson, Chicago, the trains and Dad. It was usually cold, but I didn't care. The great event of the year was happening. It was Christmas, and we were going to take the train from Crete to Chicago's Dearborn Station. I have to guess, but my recollections of trips to the city began about 1935 when I was 5 years old. Annually, on the day after Thanksgiving, we would go to Chicago. It was a family tradition. First, there was the early morning walk to the old depot. They lived on First Street and Lincoln, about 3 blocks away from the depot. There were often spots on the sidewalks of slippery ice as my mother, father, 2 sisters, and I walked the 3 blocks east from our home on First Street to the Crete Depot. For a young boy growing up in the 1930s, the Crete Depot was an exciting place. In the winter, a fragrant coal fire would be blazing in the waiting room stove to take off the chill of the cold morning. The waiting room, with its hard benches and few posters, was okay, but it was a station agent's room that I loved. In that room, which was located between the waiting room and the baggage freight room, there was a buzz of activity. Back then, Bernard Stevens presided over that room as the agent. Mr. Stevens' desk was a center of activity. The desk filled the bay window. On the desk were both the city and the railroad telephones, as well as a telegraph key, and the instrument in a wood sounder suspended on a movable extension apparatus. It seemed as if that telegraph instrument was clicking and clacking continually. I was amazed when Mr. Stevens would stop. We'd stop everything to go over to the desk to click-clack with the key. The station agent was an operator, meaning that he would receive train orders from the train dispatcher. These orders were received by telegraph, and the operator would transcribe them on a green flimsies, those thin sheets of tissue paper that were, and to some extent still are, an important part of railroad operation. Nearby sat the hoop, that Y-shaped piece of wood that the operator would use to lift the train orders up to the engineers and the conductors of passing trains. It was all fascinating to a young boy like myself. There was more to catch my attention too. Ticket selling, freight billing, handling baggage, and railroad express were all included in the Crete agent's job description. And express and baggage work included more than just the handling of trunks and suitcases. There were the products of farms, such as the great cans of cream and cardboard boxes with holes, from which came the peeping of numerous little woolly chicks. There were fragrant flowers too, and there was merchandise, all boxed and labeled. The United States mail was also of vital importance. In Crete, the management of pouches and bags of U.S. mail was the responsibility of Mr. Banzer. Mr. Banzer lived on South Main Street, 3 or 4 doors south of where the AG home is. He had a Welsh pony that he used. He had a cart behind it, and when my grandparents lived across the street, and in the afternoon he'd get this pony and the cart out, and he'd go up and get the mail and bring it up to the post office. And in wintertime he had a little sled that he would use. I mean, it was kind of neat. He made trips back and forth from the post office to the depot in a horse-drawn buggy. Later, this task was performed by Albert Pietbrink in an automobile. Albert's son, Raymond, was quite a young photographer of Crete and the C&EI. There were many C&EI men who regularly passed through the Crete depot. One of the men who was at the depot each day to ride the train into Chicago was Nelson E. Helm, Winnie Easterday's dad. He was assistant treasurer of the C&EI at Dearborn Station in Chicago. In my childhood and youth, both Mr. Helm and Mr. Stevens fulfilled their civic obligation by serving on a Crete school board. Another visitor we'd see at the depot was the C&EI section boss. He would enter the waiting room, go to a padlocked box, and then open it. Inside was a railroad phone that he would use. It was only later, when I worked as a section hand, that I learned that he was getting a lineup of the trains that was scheduled over his section of the C&EI so that he could safely operate his motor car over the busy tracks. My dad, Walt's dad, was employed by the C&EI as a yard clerk at Chicago Heights Yard Office or possibly the freight house. His employment meant many things to our family. For one thing, we rode on a free pass. And for another, he seemed to know so many employees, always talking to them about railroad personal matters. Most importantly, perhaps he knew the answer to every question a young boy could ask about railroading. My dad was with the C&EI until his death in 1960. We'd make the trip on train number 10. Number 10 was the old local that got to Crete at about 6:30 a.m., arrive at the Chicago Dearborn Station about 8 a.m. Sitting in the depot, we were told that the train was coming. Excitement would come over us, and we would leave the waiting room to stand on the station platform. I can assure you that when a massive Pacific engine rolled by, just a few feet away, this kid held his father very, very tightly. As I said, it would be cold in the early morning. The air would be a mixture of cold morning air and moist heat from the locomotive. We climbed on board, settled in our seats for the trip, with our noses pressed to the window. There'd be many stops on the 30-mile trip to Chicago. After a stop at Stager, we would pass through the Heights Yard with its tracks lying on either side of the main line, 7 on the east side, 5 on the west. My eyes would be searching for one of the C&EI's little 3600 class switch engines that would often be seen kicking cars at the south end of the yard. Always loved to see that. Is that right, Ray? Crossing the EJ&E tracks at the J Tower and then the NYC tracks at the Michigan Central Tower required much clattering, banging, thumping, bumping as part of the number 10. Moments later, we would stop at the Chicago Heights station, a lovely building of an unusual style with its arches looking like half moons. At Chicago Heights, there were more than a few people getting on, plus a considerable amount of baggage. Railway Express and mail being tossed aboard the head of the train. The Railway Express employees wearing guns on their hips always filled me with a good deal of respect. Then it was off again, leaving Chicago Heights, crossing a viaduct that carried the C&EI over the VNO transfer. There'd be a brief stops at Glenwood and Thornton. The Thornton station must have been made to slow show passengers the plant of the Thornton limestone quarry. In the 30s, they had interesting little steam engines to move their cars about in the quarry. North, we would go bumping across the Grand Trunk Western for a quick stop at South Holland. I'll be done in about a minute. Then soon on the right would appear Yaney Yard, and then another stop would be made at Yard Center. Yard Center, what a wonderful place it was with engines working. A big yard office tucked against the Sibley Boulevard overpass. Slip switches for communication between the yard tracks that spread lying both east and west of the main line. Of special interest was the engine facility with its great roundhouse and ready tracks. Off again towards Chicago, this time banging and thumping across the Pennsylvania tracks just south of the Dalton Depot. Then another stop at Kensington, the station about 115th Street. Traveling through Chicago was a great elevated blur. Wood frame houses, smoke-blackened apartment buildings, tracks, factories, trains, more tracks, the solitary stop at the Englewood station, and then the great maze of tracks that led to the Dearborn Street station train sheds. The latter portion of this trip always went too fast. There was never enough time to take in all the trains. Engines moving cars and those lovely, bright and shiny Dogville, Western Indiana, six-wheel switch locomotives. Climbing down from the train, we walked from the platform to the station, and as we walked, we were right next to the looming passenger cars. Wet, white clouds rising and hissing from the steam connections beneath the couplers. Then it would happen as we were walking right beside that monstrous Pacific that was an Pacific engine. It was alive, I'm sure of it. I would look up to the cab, and the engineer would always wave from his window. And there would be the heat radiating from the boiler and the glowing flames in the firebox that could be seen through the little holes. And slow, confused panting. It was a sound like a runner after a long race. After its long run, that engine at rest, close to the track bumper, had a right to be tranquil and calm. A Pacific she was indeed. From Polk and Dearborn Streets, we walked up to see the Christmas displays, decorations that filled the interiors of the stores and burst out into State Street from behind the great windows. People always said that they were fabulous sights, and no doubt they were. But for me, I couldn't wait for the afternoon trip home on number 21. That story's been published in quite a few railroad magazines, and the Walls received quite a bit of credit for that. Some collection and recollections in Crete. Mr. Stevens lived a block away from me on the west side, and his brother-in-law lived next door, Arnold Dolmeyer. Arnold Dolmeyer worked for the C&EI as a clerk also up in Chicago Heights. Stevens had two boys. The older one was Melvin, and the younger one was Kenny. A lot of us remember Kenny. Pearl, his wife's still alive here. But Melvin was blind in one eye. And what happened, they used torpedoes. They used torpedoes years ago to signal oncoming trains, and they would put torpedoes on the track. They'd run over them and they'd make a loud noise, and they knew they had to stop. And Melvin and some kids they got into his dad's collection of those torpedoes, and they threw them on the ground or on a track someplace, and there was a lot of like little sand pellets inside of those things, and one of those hit his eye, and he was blinded. Okay, Rich,
Can we correct your story?
go ahead.
A certain father of somebody sitting next to me was with Melvin.
Oh, is that right?
Melvin said, watch how loud this thing is. And he put it in a vise in Ferris Gaines'
Oh, boy.
basement.
Oh.
And hit it with a hammer.
Oh.
Chuck out part of the shark.
My dad saw
His-
blood and
his-
fly.
Oh, man. I didn't know the
He told that
circumstance.
story,
I knew
yeah.
it was a
Her
torpedo.
dad used to tell the
Oh,
story.
man.
Those were exciting to hear those go off.
Oh, yeah.
When you mentioned the Y
Yeah.
with the string in
Here,
it, that-
yeah.
I remember once there was something wrong up the tracks, and of course, they didn't have communication on the trains, they didn't have radio, telephones, or whatever like we do today. So Steve, I think, put 3 in a row, I think that was the signal to stop.
Okay.
And he asked me to run as far forward as and the bells were ringing as I was running towards
Oh,
Exchange
my,
Street,
yeah.
and put some there, and there was something wrong up around by Steger Furniture or
Oh,
something.
my.
Maybe there was a fire or something up there. But he had received a telegraph message
That's
to halt this train coming through.
notify people.
And they did move pretty fast.
Talked to Jimmy Adams a few years back, and Jimmy and I did a lot of things together, some not too good, some. But Jimmy reminded me, I remember when I was a kid, like I said, my grandparents lived on South Main Street, about three blocks south of Exchange. And my mother would take me in a wagon, and at that time, there were manual operated gates at Exchange Street, and there was a tower where, well, on the northeast corner where the railroad tracks cross Exchange Street. And that fellow that ran it was Mr. Lovelace, and he rented a house or part of a house at my grandparents' there. But that manual operation of that crossing on Exchange Street was connected by a great, well, like a 1-inch rod all the way up to First Street. So when he operated the one over here, it operated the one up on First Street also. You mentioned the little shed with the little hand cars that the people that maintain the track and stuff like that. You mentioned Eck Carnes. He was quite a guy. I mean, some of you remember his wife, Mert?
Yeah.
They were a neat couple. They were just a really neat couple. And,
They lived on First there,
well, you mentioned something about the a hobo and a tramp or whatever. They used to have a camp down where the creek goes underneath the railroad track, like, half a block south of First Street. And us kids, we'd see them. This Depression time, they'd be down there, maybe 10 or 12 of them together.
Up like on Columbia?
No, just the railroad track, just
Oh, on the
south.
railroad track.
Yeah,
Up by
underneath
the-
there,
There's
yeah.
a
underneath
good-sized
Yeah.
bridge.
Yeah.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. Oh, that was a no-no to go over there. Well, another thing, I think Jimmy's commented to some of us in a group where Moot Collins walked the 2 water tanks that were on the west side of the tracks there. I don't know if I did pretty good opening up here. But here's some pictures if you'd like to look at them. A lot of these were taken by Ray Piepenreich, I'm sure. There's a picture of the old depot right there. But there were two water tanks on the west side. They were about primarily just about opposite of the depot. Here they are here.
Oh, yeah.
You can see them. There's a connecting pipe between there, and early on, this Moot Collins, he lived in, well, where First Street, where the railroad crosses
First and
First Street there was an old building. I think it shows up in here too, and he lived in that. Kind of itinerant type of guy, but And he was built like the proverbial, you know what, you know. He could lift up the rear end of the Model T, and just as strong as could. But he took Jimmy and put him on his shoulders and walked him across that. And when Jimmy got a little bit older, he walked by himself. And he was telling me they were in there one day, and the water level was kind of low, and they started pumping water, and they were kind of trapped in this thing till I guess they got up high enough they could get a rung on a ladder or something. Yeah, that was something else.
Can I add to your Jimmy Adams story?
Go ahead, there's plenty of them.
I've been going through the Chicago Heights Stars way back in the teens and the 20s, and I came across a little squib where Jimmy Adams, who was probably about 3 years old at the time, I think, was at First Street, standing on the railroad tracks, got away from his mother, 2 blocks up. And this man that you told about that was operating the crossing gate saw him.
Okay.
He left his post and came down and picked up Jimmy and took him home. Rather than stand right on track, waiting for the train to come.
So where was this tower by Exchange Street and the tracks?
Northeast corner.
It was on the northeast corner,
Northeast
Where the
like
big
where,
house is, where the garage
where
is.
were the big garages for the antique place
Yeah.
now,
Mhm.
The one picture we've got of the big tree over there, you can just see the tower back there
Yeah, okay.
in the back corner.
There was also one on 34th Street in Stager, on the east side of the street there, I remember. I was looking at this picture in the background, you see the elevator there. And it's not particular to the depot, but one Saturday night, I was down by my grandparents, and there were 3 different fire alarms that night, and the first place was at that depot up here, and a short while later, well, where the post office is, right by the railroad track, Mr. Zoller had a barn. He used to do, well, hauling with great big horses and wagons, and he'd store coal and everything.
Yeah.
But, so that was on fire also. And then there was, farther down south end of town, almost the outskirts of town, there was another one. There were 3 fires, and Fred Perkon, Augie Perkon, his dad was fire chief, and he noticed this fellow being around there, and he was just itinerant. He set 3 fires that night. That was exciting time.
You know whatever became of Melvin Stevens? I was doing some research and I read that story in the Star
Yeah.
about that accident.
Was that right?
And it sounded like he was terribly disfigured, and I always wondered what became of him.
I don't think he was disfigured. I mean, it was,
He just
for
lost
kids,
sight
you know,
of
it's
him.
disfigured if the guy doesn't have an eye, you know.
But he-
I think he
does-
had a pretty good job, if I'm not mistaken.
But he didn't stay around Crete.
No, I think up in north suburbs or a suburb of Chicago.
You know, I forgotten something too I was gonna tell you. I would earn about 30 cents a week plus some ice cream cones or something. And it was supposed to be a dime, a telegram delivery. And the week before Labor Day, Steve told me, he said, "You're doing such a good job, I'm gonna give you $1 a week whether we get 1 telegram or 10. But it wasn't until maybe 10 years ago I happened to think of this. He knew I was going to school Labor Day, day after Labor Day. So he gave me this raise for the last week of summer, and then he probably figured it'd be some other 9-year-old there next year.
What year was that?
44, 45.
I was born in 35, so it would have been around 1944.
Okay.
Then what?
Roland, you had something you wanted to say, didn't you?
No, nothing as exciting as these guys, other
Tell us about the Cubs.
yeah, my first job was in 1951 at 63rd Englewood, well, 66th
Yeah, right.
Union was the general office for the whole C&EI operation. And downtown is where I would ride the train with Nelson Helm, Winnie's father. He was then treasurer. When
Right,
I
right.
worked there and he retired as
Right.
treasurer. I'd get off at 63rd and walk 3 blocks back to 62, which was, gosh, it was about a 6-story building. It was just a beehive. That's where all the track maintenance and passenger departments, everything worked out there. And downtown, Claire Rodwig, I believe, was president, Nelson Helm was treasurer, and just the executive officers were downtown. I'd get on in Chicago Heights. Crete Depot was already closed by then. And I think we'd stop at Glenwood, Thornton, and I remember going through Yard Center
Oh,
on the
yeah,
train.
oh, yeah,
That was
that's
a
all-
beehive.
that's
of-
all the activity
Yeah, that's
there.
where all the activity, fixing cars and steam engines in Kensington. And then I would get off at 63rd Street. I think I still have my C&EI pass. Any place, and we had reciprocity. I know I took a trip once to St. Louis on the Wabash River. My pass took me there just for a long weekend.
Were you just out of high school over?
Yeah, when I graduated on a Friday or Thursday and went to work there Monday morning. I was the office boy, carried the mail, sorted the mail out, because they had about 6, 7 stories in this building. And then they had a big printing press, and I tried for that, printed up. They had forms, and I did the printing of all the railroad forms that they had. And I got drafted into the Korean War. And that was my career with C&EI.
You know, when you're talking about C&EI, there are 4 Roush boys who work for the C&EI, 5 Roush boys who work for the C&EI in the Yard Center.
In the Yard Center? Oh, yeah. Yeah, that was a beehive of activity up there.
They had boxcars that were for families, the Olds and the Slaughters and the Roushes had a boxcar, like a little house. And I almost thought that that was gonna be my future.
Well, that was a busy place. I know they repaired cars, engines.
Dick Hines and Matt Roush were very close together. There was a Roush in Milford that was on the C&EI, and Charles in Cayuga, Indiana.
Cayuga.
So they were the Roushes were very railroad people.
And the C&I ran all the way to Florida, but I think as they got down south, they had to get interlined, yeah, with other railroads.
L&M.
Yeah, Louisville and Nashville, that's right.
L&M.
Yeah, L&M,
They
yeah.
had at that Yard Center, they had like a little hotel
Yes, they did.
there.
Yes,
That
they did.
the railroad people could have showers and.
Right.
Oh, yeah.
And a restaurant and everything,
Yeah.
yes, I remember that.
Well, they had one at Faithorn too.
The
It's
whole
interesting, I'm just looking at this picture, it's an overhead shot from First Street down the Exchange, and it shows that tower down there that man operated.
What page is that on, or what is that?
This is on page 219.
It's okay, this way, it's further.
So this is.
Oh, yeah, yeah, I
This is the first
remember.
one.
Yeah.
This is a great book.
Yes, it is.
It's a great read.
I think my wife put it away. I do remember it.
But I just brought it along. Here's a picture of the Crete Depot with the passenger train right there.
And the hotel across the street.
Yeah,
there.
right. If you have an opportunity, go down to Beecher and look at the depot down there. It's an exact replica of the one in Crete. It's really in good shape. I don't like to blow my own horn. I worked maybe about 1/2 of 1% on it, but I did help with some things. But the Beecher Historic Society is in there now. I believe they're completely moved. I believe they're planning on doing some kind of a special opening affair for it. It is really nice. It is.
It's all done now?
Yeah, the interior is all done. They're just moving things
they have the telegraph set up to go between the house and the caboose.
Oh, is that right?
So that
Oh.
people that are training for
Huh.
like Morse code.
Yeah.
They
I'll
go
be,
back and
I'll be
forth.
darned. Yeah. It's really nice inside. There's a, I don't know if you people know that building is exactly like the one that was at Crete, that people were talking about. And the one at Beecher, and it was moved over to Monee for the Thompson Farms, which is just off of Route 50, Governor's Highway, and where the overpass is and stuff. And it's back, it's on the,
You had the winery.
yeah, the winery. It didn't pan out. And then, what, 4 years ago, they brought it back to Beecher, and structurally it was okay, but it was a lot of work. Two people, Kenny Hammeister and the mayor, Paul Lohman, devoted hours and hours and hours in there. It just really, there was a lot of materials and time donated, but it's really, really magnificent inside. I was in there maybe a month ago. There's a, I think it was a window out of a house that was over near the golf course, an older house they took down, and it's a picture of, I think, some officer in the Civil War, but it was a picture in a picture window, and they had it on the south end, and they've got it lighted in the back, and it's just pretty as can be. It's just really, really nice. So maybe sometime we can make a group tour down there or something.
That would be
It'd be
nice,
good.
yeah. Very good.
Sure.
Are they open Saturday mornings?
I don't know
or
what their
Saturday?
schedule is yet. I
Okay.
don't know. Really don't
I'll call for
know.
Jim.
Yeah.
Let me ask you, were you flipping trains,
No.
jumping on and off? When you said you jumped off of one and you took a roll.
No, it was off of the delivery, the old Buick that we
Oh,
had,
okay.
when we would deliver
Yeah.
the Railway Express.
Mr. Stevens was pretty civic minded. He was on the school board for a long, long time. And when Marge first started teaching, I think he was treasurer. I remember his signature on checks and things like that. He was a great guy.
Who was the Adams that stayed in the old hotel there? The last one. Was it
Myron, yeah.
He didn't have a straight finger on his hand, because he got them all caught in belts and
There's a
everything.
picture of him in here.
But he came over to Steve one morning and asked if he could have some help. He had, was it a Model A or a Model T pickup truck? You remember that?
I think so.
And there was a door that was on the corner of the building, facing the depot.
Right,
Northwest
right.
corner.
At an
And it
angle.
went down in the basement.
angle.
At an angle.
Yeah.
And he backed up his truck into there and was loading
That's what he's
something
talking
or
about.
unloading, but all of a sudden the front wheels were up. He'd overloaded, or the load of coal he had on there shifted. And he asked for all of us to come over there and hang on the front bumper.
He was something else. He was an Adams,
And of course, so we played seesaw with him until we got.
And Adams was one of our founding fathers,
That's
ever.
right.
I can't say too much.
Good for them.
Which family of that? There were people in this town with 3 different branches.
Yeah, I think so.
Way back. You know,
His mother and dad were pretty
Yeah,
sensible
yeah.
people. I don't know, boys get so half-cocked.
Well, Jimmy's mother he was a goer.
Oh, was she?
Yeah, Ida was something else.
She was full of life, wasn't she?
Yeah. Well, I'd just like to introduce you to a couple of people. These are Marge's cousins. This is Ray Poppy. He worked the railroad out at Baythorn, out of Milwaukee, and Bill Muirhead still lives on the Muirhead farm on Richmond Road, East Richmond Road, near where 2 houses west of the expressway on Richmond Road.
I like to say the middle farm.
There you go.
Middle farm.
Well, Ray, even though we're talking about the depot in Crete, do you have anything to add about where you work?
Oh, I don't know. I've seen a lot of things happen in my days too, from 1947, but I come to this.
Ray, when you started, were you on steam engines then yet?
Oh, yeah.
You were on steam engines.
October 9th, 1947, and we had Richard C. Austin, Dick C. Osmond, Ed Merritt, and Krebs. It was the day shift on the switch engine, so that's where I made my first day. A lot of you probably know, they're long gone, but because it was 100, you see, it's living like our fathers.
You started in 47?
Yeah.
A lot
I
of
just say, at times, what was it, Curtis and,
brothers.
there's a brother?
Yeah.
And I'm trying to think of the fireman.
Yeah, lots of railroad people in Crete.
Mhm.
Milwaukee Road kind of had a bunch of people.
Who did Joe Forrest get before?
And-
Joe was out, I think, on
Oh,
the
yeah.
bus.
But his dad was on the C&EI. Like, nobody knew Joe Schwartz's dad.
Yeah, oh yeah.
He was on the
He was engineer, wasn't he? Was he engineer?
I know he was on the C&EI.
Didn't John Newhouse's dad work on the Milwaukee too?
He's gone.
I don't know what my.
Yeah, we did that later, I think before he
that
was a
right?
plumber,
Is
he
that
worked
right?
at, he worked at, yeah, he worked at Faithorn.
Jake Hussman,
Jake
was he
Osmond.
an engineer? I think they enacted some mandatory retirement law after he was past that age or something. So he kept taking runs out anyhow to keep his
Seniority going?
something go, because when we lived on Main Street, I forget how old he was, but he would go out once a weekend. And it almost seems to me that he was engineer one evening when there were a few boys from Crete killed. I think they were
On 34th Street?
on 34th Street, right. Was one of them a Bookmeyer?
I don't remember anymore, but it was a foggy night. or
McReynolds,
something.
Dick McReynolds was one of them. and
Yeah, I remember that.
Was Harold Bookmeyer killed in that? I think he was.
I think he was, yeah.
I think there were 3 boys from Crete that were killed. They were fleeing the police or something. I think they had alcohol in the car and they were underage.
It was so foggy, you couldn't see any.
Yeah, they rode right into it, didn't they? Into the train that was there.
Now, what's he injured?
Oh, he came down Lincoln on the exchange,
Yeah.
car hit.
Yeah.
He didn't stop.
He was on a
On
bike.
his bicycle, going like a bat, he was having a ball.
Yeah.
All the kids used to.
Well, one of the pluses that you had if you worked for the railroad, you could ride on their line or even other lines on the pass.
Yeah.
And when I was courting Marge, and even first few years after we were married, we go downtown and go to a movie, and almost all of them had stage shows at the time. And we, generally Saturday nights, we'd go up and get a bite to eat. And there was a train, the C&EI train, that left Dearborn Station about 10 minutes to 12, something like that, maybe a little earlier. And we could ride past, and Marge could, and it wasn't very much. It was like 35 cents to come from downtown Crete. And they'd stop in Chicago Heights, and that was the last regular stop. But we could get off at First Street. The conductor would notify the engineer, and we got real good service. You know. And it was a cheap outing. You know. But she rode past on the Santa Fe all the time. She went to school. She went to school at Park College just outside of Kansas City, and she rode back and forth on that. In wartime, things were pretty crowded on the trains. And railroads were a great tradition, I'll tell you.
We took our 4 kids, went over to State or Depot, bought tickets, because we're not on our line, of course, went to the station in Chicago. We went to Dearborn, we had a walkover then to Union Station.
No, it's a long
I
walk.
was gonna take a ride out west, and so our agent, he says, well, be sure and tell me when to go beyond. What was it? I'm trying to think what that was. But he says, go beyond there, then you'll get to ride the high Watson, otherwise you won't get there. So we done that, and it was quite a scenic ride to go along the, when you go through the dells, out along the Mississippi River. Really a nice scenic ride. When we got to Milwaukee, then when we went on to Minneapolis, that's right, we didn't go all the way. And then we sat and waited for a trip to come back. And when we come back, of course, we caught the ice and come to 211th Street and bus home. But it was the old cars, you know, went through the dells and along the really a scenic ride along the Mississippi.
Well, Carol probably remembers this story too and all of her research. But the C&EI, I don't know if it was the C&EI at that time, or it was the other line, but where the Congregational Church is now, that was just a single track that went through there. And then they put another track in, and that track was pretty close to the existing Congregational Church building. And when Marge's mother passed away and we went through things upstairs in the kind of closet off in the lower roof line, we ran across a lot of history and events and stuff from the Congregational Church, which is the bazaar there now, antique place. But there was communication between the Congregational Church and whatever railroad at that time. And because it was damaging the foundation for the Congregational Church, it was too close. And I gave Ray Petering a whole bunch of these things, and Ray came across these communications, these letters and stuff went back and forth. And the gist of it was it took a long time, and eventually they moved the Congregational Church over like I don't know, 15, 20 feet or something like that. And I think they gave him $50 to do that.
Does anyone know about the original building of the railroad and how it came about in Crete? I've got a story to tell, but I don't want to say something I don't know what I'm talking about. And I heard from family, because my great-grandmother gave land for that when the railroad came through, they said, we will build a railroad here if you will contribute the land. Not just my great-grandmother, but everybody else would have. This is how they got the land for building the railroad. It had to be contributed by people who...
But didn't the government give these railroads all the land?
That was not a land grant. The IC was a land grant.
Oh. Because out west, that was all... Oh, the transcontinental. Okay.
Mile square, all the way down the line. So it was given that. Land was given to them as an incentive to build the road. But not the IC, not the C&EI. But that was down almost all over in the west.
From what I've read, that the community was trying to get the railroad to come in, and they would donate so much money or something.
$18,000.
Well, no, this was even otherwise. That was when, that was what was at the Milwaukee?
No, that must have been the,
But anyhow, I've read already where this farmer gave so much money, this farmer gave so much money, that farmer gave so much. And it was the farmers, because of the grain.
They were the ones that needed it.
Yeah.
Yeah. Nope, no shit.
Those are their products.
But in our family, the story was passed down. My great-grandmother donated the land, the right-of-way for the train, the railroad to go through, and others too. She wasn't the only. My mother and father right next to her.
Well, during the Depression time, you'd see people walking the railroad tracks with, we call them gunny sacks, burlap sacks. They'd pick up coal so they could...
Sometimes they climbed up on the cars too.
Yeah.
Pick them off.
My brother-in-law tells
And went back and picked them up and got caught.
Yeah.
Get on that 26th Street and pitch it off until we got through the ice. We'd have to bank it cold.
Anybody here ever worked as a switchman on the railroad?
Oh, Ray was switchman, right? Ray wasn't.
No, you must have been there at the time I was working there
Okay, fine.
in the summer of '47 as a
Yeah.
switchman.
Well, they didn't know all the whole time.
Well, it's been a
You
long
was
time,
the-
I knew some of them in school, but my uncle was a fireman at the time, Bill Hughes.
Oh, he was, of course, I know. Sat beside him a lot of times, but.
That was a dull job. You'd go from here to Pennsylvania, it takes 9 hours to get there. And we usually got stopped up near the Grange, a big prairie out in the middle of nowhere. Because of Santa Fe coming out from Chicago on the south right.
Yeah.
All those cross lanes had the right of way over us.
Right.
And we'd have to wait for, that's it, 3 or 4 hours in the middle of summer, in that prairie, sitting on that steam engine behind my uncle, and hotter than Joey B. Darn. Sweating up a storm, and you couldn't do it, you couldn't go away, you couldn't even get a drink of water.
Hughes? Hughes was your uncle?
Bill Hughes.
Hughes, yeah. But when, first time I met Chuck, I tried to hear, Jake's youngest son, Chuck. He was out walking, he pulled up to face our crossing, and he came over to the engine, and he told us who he was. That's the first time I never knew that our kids had him as a gym teacher or something at the school, but he come up there and he says, told us who he was, and he said, my dad used to be an engineer there.
C&EI has a historic society, they've had it for a number of years, they do publication, and they kind of use the depot that's down at Watsika. They moved that, it's a good sized brick building that they moved because there were two rails. C&EI used the north-south, TP&W Railroad, so this building sat right across, right on the southeast side of it, and they moved it maybe block and a half east and then back south again and set it on a good foundation. But it's quite a building, and they have events down. In fact, as I did a last Labor Day, they approached me if I'd do a Sears Roebuck presentation. So I did. That was on Saturday, but they had other events going on.
You still got the displays in the old courthouse?
Yeah. Well, they've got displays in the depot too.
Well, do you wanna just, have some refreshments and look to see what Everett has
Yes.
here and there, and,
Do you have any questions, what you run across here? I'm not a railroad man, but maybe I should.
Yeah, and if anyone has any pictures of the railroad or anything, well, as I said, we can copy them real quick. If I don't have a client with me, I'll run up to the Osco to get a copy and bring it back, so.
There are more cookies, and we put them out, because there are more people.
Thanks so much for coming to.
Thank you for coming and participating.
Thanks very much.
So I thought I'd try it off and rent it over these old
There, they moved that depot.
and then the black cigarettes that were in the park. They were like little
Started to
pieces
dig it
of
out.
razor blade.
And they were talking about moving the LG building further over.
I knew.
Well, it's actually a track on there, kid, you know.
All by itself.
It does.
They were talking tracks.
We were talking about moving the action, the old courthouse.
Oh, they had all kinds of problems with that new courthouse.
I was down there, I tickled something, it was pretty new then.
Yeah, I went down there. I told them. Yeah. And I went down to the courthouse, talking about the courthouse, yeah, the old one they had, now you're from Metro, it is a beautiful.
Yeah, I kinda remember too.
Hi, Phyllis. It was for me. Oh, boy. Okay.
We were raised her mother just gave her a big sure never had. Her sister told her things out there, so always coming over.
I got something on my computer. I've been having trouble.
And when her mother found it out,
And, last I
you know
heard.
when you got a sibling around you, you're not gonna get by with it at home.
Me, yeah, and I said I could make it, and no, I can't make it. You get a church service or two? Yeah. No, I haven't been able to get back in since then, and then that was yesterday, so I don't know what he did after that. Well, it's coming up.
My father used to be a fireman up there. Is that right? Working where you were.
And that worked really well. I kept it.
Next 3 months, I got back. 63rd. In them days, that was like O'Hare Airport. Still, and all the commuters used to get too.
Programming, but it's only like 4 times a day. I thought we could run 10 weeks shut down.
We remember when those came out, 46. I remember South there, because they knew this train was coming down.
But you could have done it.
Green
You could have had 1 10.
That was there quite a few years ago, though, but it didn't want to do it.